The effects of the Great Depression. Men and women ended up living in litos, made of scrap wood and metal, and families went without meat and fresh vegetables for months. Existing on appetite of soup and beans, Americans suffered years of poverty. Unemployment stood in lines for hours, waiting for relief checks. Veterans sold apples or pencils on street corners. People left the city for the countryside, but found no salvation on the farm life. Crops rotted in the fields because prices were too low to make harvesting worthwhile. Sheriffs had to fend off angry people because banks were foreclosing long overdue mortgages from farms. African Americans left the poverty of the South for factory jobs in the North, and they were the first to be laid off. Nearly 500,000 Mexicans were deported in the 1930s, including families with children born in the U.S. People with poverty knew how to survive the cold winters, patched their shoes with pieces of rubbers from discarded tires, heated only the kitchens of their house, and ate scraps of other people's food. Middle class was hit hard. Professionals and white-collar workers wouldn't ask for help. One New York dentist and his wife turned on the gas and left a note saying, "We want to get out of the way before we are forced to accept relief money. If you fall behind on payments, you'll lose your house and face eviction." Healthcare declined because people stopped going to since healthcare declined, people stopped going to doctors and dentists. Men, boys, and women rode the railroads in search of jobs. The Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1939 and was the worst economic downturn in history of the industrialized world. This began after the stock market crash of October 1929, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. Over 10 years, consumers' spending and investing dropped, causing declines in industrial and in employment as companies laid off workers. 1933, the Great Depression reached its lowest point. Some 15 million Americans were unemployed, and many banks had failed. By 1933, unemployment had risen from 3% to 25%. Of the nation's workforce. Wages fell 42%. Government leaders passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff to protect domestic industries and jobs. World trade plummeted to 65%, and the Dust Bowl hit the Midwest. So, for fighting the Depression, Herbert Hoover was the Great Depression's biggest victim. When the downfall hit in 1929, he tried to rally the nation with bold forecasts of better days ahead. This gave the people mistrust in him. Hoover rejected the proposals of strong government actions. He called on private charities and local government to help feed and clothe those in need. Taxes were cut. He proposed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is the RFC, in 1932. They loaned government money to finance institutions to save them from bankruptcy. Hoover failed to dig the U.S. out of the Great Depression. He ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear out the Bond's army. In June 1932, this group of 20,000 World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. to demand immediate payment of their adjusted compensation bonuses voted by Congress in 1924. Congress rejected their demands, and President Hoover, fearing that their ranks were infested with criminals and radicals, had them removed from the encampment. Public relations and disaster for Hoover. Nation's banking structure was coming to a collapse. Bank failings started to rise in 1931 and in 1932 as customers responded to rumors of bankruptcy by rushing to withdraw their deposits. Many Americans were ready for new leadership in the White House. For the causing of the Great Depression, according to Ben Bernanke, the past chairman of the Federal Reserve, the central bank helped create the Depression. Bernanke highlighted the Fed's 5 critical mistakes. 1 being the Fed began raising the federal funds rate in the spring of 1928. It kept increasing it through a recession that started in August 1929. The second mistake was when the stock market crashed, investors turned to the currency markets. At that time, the gold standard supported the value of the dollars held by the US government. The third mistake was the Federal raised interest rates again to preserve the dollar value. More bankruptcies followed. The fourth mistake is the Fed didn't increase the supply of money to combat deflation. The fifth mistake, investors withdrew all of their deposits from banks. The failure of the banks created more panic. The Feds ignored the banks, situation destroyed, and consumers remained confident in financial institutions. Money supply decreased. For these effects, the supply of the US dollars fell 30%. In 1932, the country elected Franklin D. Roosevelt as president. Franklin D. Roosevelt, also known as FDR, was an American statesman and political leader who served as the 32nd president of the U.S. from 1933 until his death in 1945. In 1932, he proposed to create federal government programs to end the Great Depression. With the 100 days, he signed the New Deal into law. This created 42 new agencies and was designed to create jobs, allow unionization, and provide unemployment insurance. This includes Social Security, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This helped safeguard the economy and prevent another depression. A big thing that also hit the United States was the Dust Bowl. It was a drought and soil erosion brought on by overfarming and turning the agriculture land at the Great Plains into a giant dust bowl during the 1930s. This happened when many people left the cities to start farming because of unemployment. They did this because they couldn't find jobs in the city and no one was hiring because of the wages that were getting cut. This hit the western Kansas, Oklahoma, eastern Colorado, and the Texas Panhandle. Farmers abandoned their land, and at a certain point, they tried to find more soil by working on it more and more and taking the soil off the land on the top, which created the Dust Bowl. Many Americans had it so bad that they needed a new leadership, and this is when FDR came into play.